VLPSos here. This is a video lesson for Python programming, passing to functions. These videos are made so that they can be paused to give you time to practice. We learned how to make our own functions. We do that with the keyword def, which means that we are going to define our own function called, in this case, do something. It has the argument parameters, so the do something is more than a variable, it's the name of a function. A colon, and then the code block is indented under the definition. When the do something function is called, it will execute its code block, and in this case, we will print something is done. We can do anything we wish. We can use as many lines of code as we wish in our functions. This function only does something simple. It prints that one line. Now, if I saved and ran my program now, remember that the function doesn't automatically run. We have to call it. And we call it like we do any other function in the standard library. We refer to it by name, and we include the parentheses, which we call the argument parameters. Now, this line, which is not a part of the code block of the do something function because it's not indented to be a part of it, is the one that calls the function, which means that our program will go look to this function and execute the lines in it. If we ran our program now, we can see that the function must be called because it printed the line that we'd expect. Note that our new function does not make use of the parentheses or function parameters. They're there, but we haven't put anything into them. We haven't included anything to pass to the function. But they need to be there for the language to think of the function being called. And we'll write another function. In this case, we are defining a function that we're calling class printer, and we're including a variable inside the parentheses, the function parameters, which suggests that we're defining this function to expect something to be passed to it when it's called. We'll finish what we are going to use this function for by writing its code block, assigning a period initial value of 1, and then printing some simple graphic for a visual effect. A for loop for item in schedule, and note that schedule is the name of the variable that we are calling the input to this function. So schedule has been written in the argument parameters, and now we're going to use whatever value that variable takes in a for loop. For item in schedule, print capital P with an integer symbol, and then S, and supply those values of the integer with the variables period and item. Note that item is the iterating variable, so its values will come from the list that we're iterating through called schedule, and period has been defined here and set an initial value of 1. In the code block for the for loop, we will also increment period, which means add 1 to it, so it's counting up. And then also part of the code block of the class printer function that we're writing, but not in the code block of the for loop, will have another print of this visual line. And let's make a note. Think about what this function can be used for. It accepts a variable called schedule. It's there in the argument parameters, and uses a for loop to iterate through it. So schedule ought to be a list. If we are going to use the function, we need to prepare lists to pass to the function. A list has been prepared. The contents of the list are the names of classes, and this list has been assigned to the variable sauce schedule. So with this list and the class printer function, I can now call the class printer function by its name and send to it, because the class printer is defined to expect something to be sent to it, the list sauce schedule. If I save and run, I can see that I have a nice printout of what looks to be a school schedule with the periods and the classes for each period in a list and these visual clues to encapsulate the schedule. Again, this is sending this list, the contents of the schedule, to the function class printer and going through the process, which includes a for loop to list it all out. The line above is a call to class printer with sauce schedule, which is a variable. Sauce schedule has been sent to the class printer. The function uses what was passed to it to print out a schedule. And again, in this note, the capitals are the standard vocabulary that we use to talk about calling functions and the language about what we send to them. We'll use the words in capitals quite a bit. The benefits of functions is that they may be reused. So I wrote a function called class printer, and I sent to it a list, but I can reuse that code, the class printer code, and simply send it a different list. I can call it again, and in this case, in the argument parameters, I'm going to send it a different schedule, Catan schedule, which has been defined above, which is a new list of classes. And if I run it, I can see two schedules printed out. There's been two calls to the class printer function. The schedules are different, and I can visually distinguish between the two because of the visual print lines. We can send as many things as we want to a function. We just have to make sure the function has been written to expect what we pass to it. And of course, what we mean by that is in the definition, we included a variable inside the parentheses to expect this function to have something passed to it. And when we used it, we had to send something to it. We had to send a list. I'm going to write another function. I'm going to call def for define, the function that we're going to call citizen. If I can type. And in this case, we're going to write our function to expect two things to be sent to it. So we've created two variables, name and number. Our citizen function will use both of them. First, we'll have a print line. Hello, citizen. And then another print line in the code block of the citizen function. %s, well, we'll start the string, and then %s will now be referred to as capital C and then a %i, and supply those values, the s and the I, as a string and an integer with the variables name and number. The values of name and number are the same that we expect to be passed when we call the citizen function. So when we use the citizen function, we have to make sure that we give the correct information so that our function, the code block in our function, can use it. For example, we'll call the citizen function here, and in the parentheses, I'm going to supply it a string and an integer. When we run our code, we can see that the code block of the citizen function has been used and the string and the number was used in that print line. The values came from the information that we passed when we called the function. We can use functions as many times as we want. We need to supply what it expects, but we can give it different values. Here I have another call to the citizen function, and I can see in the output that it will repeat the function just using the new values for the same variables. We have to be careful to use functions as expected. For instance, if I call citizen and put an integer first, so I've supplied two things, but I have switched the order, and I run my program now, I will get an error. In this case, the function was used the first two times, but in the third time, when it got to the formatting using an integer and a string, then the name, which is the first thing in the argument parameter, took on the value which was the first thing that was passed to it. So name became that integer, and number, the second thing, took the value of the second thing passed to it. So name became an integer, number became a string, and when it was used in this line to print, it had a problem with name being an integer because in the print it expected to print a string and it didn't get it at that point. Here's another thing that can go wrong, which is typical, that creates bugs, and that is if we pass just one thing to citizen when it expects two, we'll have to comment out the line above it because we know that creates an error. In this case, the call to citizen is passing one value. It's a string, and citizen will use the variable name and assign the string that we pass to it to be the value of name. But there is no second thing that was passed. And the function needs it, or else it'll give this error, and it says quite correctly that there is a missing one required positional argument. It's missing the second thing, which should be an integer. We need to comment this out because it breaks our program. Much, much more to learn about functions and passing, but this has tripled your programming power. To be able to use functions and pass information to them is something that we do all the time in our programs. Now you have seen how to define functions that take input, write a function that takes 3 or more values and prints something based on the values passed to the function. Call your function a few times, each time sending a different value or different values. You saw a function take 2 values, write a function that takes 3 or more. Have fun.